Welcome, my name is Johan Norberg and I am here to talk about this new book, Why as a Muslim I Defend Liberty, by Mustafa Akyol, or as we Swedes say, Varför jag som muslim försvarar frihet. And I'm delighted to be talking about this book with its author, Mustafa Akyol. Mustafa is a Turkish journalist and one of the most important public intellectuals of our time, with a special expertise in the intersection of public policy, Islam and modernity. In July 2021, Prospect magazine listed him among the world's top 50 thinkers. He's a frequent opinion writer for the New York Times and the author of many other books, including also Islam Without Extremes, and Reopening Muslim Minds, two other great books. So if you like the new one, you'll have plenty of goodies ahead of you. Mustafa is also a senior fellow at the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C. And full disclosure, so am I. So in a way, Mustafa and I are colleagues, but I'll try to remain inscrutably objective despite that. Welcome, Mustafa.
Thank you so much, Johan, for hosting me in this conversation and for introducing me in such generous words, and for the blogs for the books as well. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for taking the time to have this chat with me. So let's start from the top. When we look around the world, we see that many Muslim countries are military dictatorships, theocracies, illiberal democracies, and many terrorist groups talk about how Islam is in a war with liberalism and modernity. So it seems that there's something that's not a perfect fit between Islam and liberalism. It's easy to come to the conclusion that there's something problematic with rule of law, free markets and individual freedom in relationship with Islam. But as we know from Christian history, our religious wars and the heretics burnt at stakes, there is a tension within every culture, within every religion, between how to interpret it in liberal or illiberal ways. And we know a more open interpretation of Islam is possible because we've had it in the past, and you've written and talked a lot about that, how Islam under its golden age was remarkably open relative to other cultures at the time. Could you please elaborate on that?
Of course, Johan, thank you so much. Indeed, I mean, the Islamic world doesn't look great from a perspective of human freedom, toleration, flourishing. As you said, I mean, there are oppressive interpretations of Islam that are the basis of law in more than a dozen countries. There are apostasy laws, blasphemy laws. There are laws that discriminate against women or minorities. Again, Islamic world is very complex. There are more than 50 Muslim majority states, so we should be cautious against seeing them as one monolithic bloc. Actually, with the Cato Institute, I published a report a few years ago, Freedom in the Muslim World, based on the Human Freedom Index that we actually publish at the Cato Institute. And there you see that some Muslim majority countries are quite free and liberal, like Bosnia-Herzegovina or Albania. But when you go to the other end of the spectrum, you come to countries like Saudi Arabia, or Iran, or Afghanistan, or Syria. So they're very oppressive, sometimes politically, sometimes religiously, sometimes a mix of both. There's violence and terrorism and also too. I mean, that's, of course, a major problem. Now, by looking at this, some people say, well, Islam doesn't look to be a tolerant religion, and that's what Islam is and what it can be. Well, I will only remind to them, well, if you just went back a few centuries ago, and if you look at Christendom, you would not have a great idea about the compatibility of Christianity with toleration, right? Look at early 17th century. There was a 30 years war between the Catholics and Protestants. Sects were really killing each other. Heretics were being burned at the stake. Their books were being burned. And kings assumed that they have divine rights to rule their people, and the people could not speak against them. Now, that really dark era in Christendom changed. It evolved into the European Union, into Sweden, and all the freedoms we have in Europe right now, which I value. One reason I supported Turkey's EU accession process, which didn't go well so far, but anyway, that's another discussion. But how Christianity was able to change, well, it wasn't overnight, but it was able to change thanks to ideas of freedom and toleration, ideas promoted by thinkers like John Locke and John Toland or Leibniz or Spinoza, or a lot of Enlightenment thinkers. And some of them were critical of religion, but many others especially that I find very interesting, like Locke, they were not against Christianity. They were Christians themselves. They just reinterpreted Christianity and said, you know what, actually in the Bible, there's no basis for a Christian commonwealth. And they said, actually, by using coercion, we're not helping our religion. It's not the values of it. And they look at scripture from a new lens, found bases in it that were there, but that was not noticed enough. So that new reinterpretation of Christianity, and it took a long time. I mean, don't forget, I mean, we even had fascism on the road. I mean, this like terrible ups and downs while coming to liberal democracy. I believe Islamic world, parts of it at least, is in a John Locke moment. It's a time when coercive interpretations of religion has created a lot of crises. It has created the Taliban, it creates the Saudi regime or the Iranian regime. And more Muslims are yearning for an understanding of Islam that is compatible with the idea of freedom, of toleration, of the individual being able to make his or her choices. Those interpretations are not unheard of. They are there. But I'm trying to put them together in a way that can be more appealing and convincing for the thinking Muslim anywhere. Am I optimistic about the future? Yes. And I think Christianity has changed, and I see the yearning for change, but we have to work on it. And that's what my book, Why as a Muslim I Defend Liberty, is about. I mean, I put all the arguments about liberty in a nutshell. Here's how to begin to think on these issues.
And that's a good point. In a way, what needs explaining is not what has happened with Islam, but why was it that certain Christian European countries moved away from authoritarianism and intolerance? But yet there's some explaining that needs to be done, because if you go back 1,000 years, the Abbasid Caliphate with the center in Baghdad was remarkably open and tolerant for its time, and certainly compared to European countries. And free trading and commercial empire, something apparently went wrong at some stage in history. What was that?
Very good question, and actually connects me to your part of your first question. Some things went wrong in Islam, and some things went right in the West at the same time in the past couple of centuries. And thank you for reminding it. I mean, Islam had its golden era, which include economic prosperity, free trade, discovery of foreign traditions like philosophy, Greek philosophy. I mean, Muslims were the ones who actually discovered the value of Plato and Aristotle and Galen and all the Greek philosophers. Not all of their ideas are relevant today, but it was a very important historical input. And they translated them into Arabic, and those Arabic translations ultimately entered to Europe from Muslim Spain and had a very big influence in European Renaissance, let's say. So this was possible. And also, one more thing, the medieval Islamic world was more free, again, than Christendom. And the people who can testify to this are Jews who have been repeatedly persecuted in Europe, and they fled often to the lands of Islam. I mean, Turkey has a Sephardic Jewish community which fled 15th century Spain to the Ottoman Empire because the Catholics at the time were forcing them to convert into Christianity or be persecuted, basically, and they found freedom in the lands of Islam. So that gives me, as a Muslim, a hope that we had better times and we can have them again. But what was the secret of that? I mean, that's a very good question. In the beginning, Islam really came as a liberating force in world history. First to Arabs. I mean, they were really killing each other as tribes. I mean, there was constant tribal warfare, and the individual didn't matter, but the tribes matter in that world. Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, came as a former merchant who turned into a prophet, right? With an idea of monotheism, but he united the tribes, and he even gave Jews and Christians, former monotheists, the right to practice their religion under Muslim rule. That created a big empire where you had serious rule of law. So you could trade in that empire freely, even if you're a Christian or a Jew, and that was later extended to Hindus and Buddhists as well. You didn't have the exact same rule rights with Muslims, so there was some superiority, which is not ideal for today for sure. But for that time, you could be a Jewish merchant or a Christian merchant, and you would know that your contracts would be honored. Courts would still respect your rights. And in the first few centuries, both with the discovery of ancient traditions, especially ancient Greece, Muslims had a scientific output. I mean, Muslims became the pioneers of mathematics and geometry. And at the time, because philosophy included all these areas of human knowledge, including medicine, for example, Muslims became pioneers in those because they were open-minded, they were cosmopolitan. And also, thanks to Islam's positive attitude about trade, Muslims became the center of the world trade. They were the pioneers in it too. They invented some banking techniques that went its way into Europe ultimately. But a lot of Muslims have longing for that golden age of Islam. You know, we were the biggest civilization, most enlightened. But what was the secret of that? I mean, some fundamentalists say the secret was that we were pious. We should be pious again, and we should make sure everybody is pious. So we should force women to wear the headscarf. So, but I think no, the secret was we were cosmopolitan and self-confident, and Muslims didn't shy away from learning from Aristotle or Plato, although they were infidels, right, from an Islam. They didn't say that we don't care about their ideas. They learned from it. Today, it doesn't mean we should go and be Platonic again, but we can learn from Hayek today, or Karl Popper, or you name it. I mean, all the philosophers that we can find intriguing today. And also Muslims, that diversity, the fact that there were Christians and Jews and Hindus and different groups in Islam, they all had certain rights. That was the source of the richness of Islam. So I believe in reviving that cosmopolitanism, which was the hallmark of Islamic civilization, which is lost big time in the past few centuries, when Muslims turned both insular and also insecure, and Western colonialism has something to do with that. But the reaction against that turned into a very closed mindset, right? And which we still see in the banning of books and, you know, banning of websites and all the punishing people for ideas, which happens in places like Iran or Saudi Arabia.
And how much of that shift away from that openness was an expression of a lack of cultural self-confidence, for lack of a better concept, of defeats against Western colonialists? And whenever you're shaken like that, there is this tendency to turn inwards and try to find something better in the past rather than exploring the future.
It had a lot. I mean, the main problem here is that modernity changed everything, right? Before modernity, you wouldn't think that Islamic world is less developed or it has less freedom. Quite the contrary. You would think that actually Islam is more tolerant to minorities compared to Christendom, because Christians didn't have the same people of the book concept that Islam had. So Jews could be persecuted, and you wouldn't expect to be a Muslim and find religious freedom in the middle of Sweden back then. But today you have more than what you have in the lens of Islam. So with modernity, with enlightenment, with liberalism especially, things started to change dramatically in the West, and also technological advance came with that, and better weapons and armies came with that. And ultimately, it began in the Ottoman Empire. Muslims began to realize that they're losing this big, you know, civilizational competition. But what is the solution, right? What is the way out, or what went wrong? I mean, a historian, Bernard Lewis, who passed several years ago, some of his political stances can be discussed, but I think he was a good historian as a historian. And he has this book, What Went Wrong in Islam, right? I mean, Muslims have been struggling with that question. And Lewis says something helpful. You can give two different answers to when you feel you're not powerful, when you feel you're defeated. You can say, what mistake did we make? Or you can say, who did this to us? So when your civilization is in trouble, or your society or country, there are two ways of trying to seek a solution and finding a culprit, right? First, you can either say, what mistake did we make? And so what are the rational solutions we can find? And many Muslims think this way, and that's the right way of thinking, I think. What mistake we make? We lost our cosmopolitanism, we lost openness. Maybe we had theological or jurisprudential views that stagnated us. And as a solution, let's learn from who did it better than us. You know, oh, constitutional government is a good idea. Oh, free market is good. Then it's, you know, brings peace to society, prosperity to society. So you can be more open-minded as a solution. Or instead of saying what mistake we made, you can ask, who did this to us? Which conspiratorial power, you know, actually brought our doom, and who are these enemies, right? And when you begin to think like that, you see the outside world as the enemy. You begin to see their enemies within, their collaborators, which is the blueprint for authoritarianism. And unfortunately, the Islamic world had many versions of that. We had xenophobic nationalist authoritarian regimes, Islamist authoritarianism. They believe that there's a conspiracy against Islam. Against it, we should be vigilant against the so-called enemies within and without. And when you begin to think like that, you dig yourself deeper into a hole. Unfortunately, that's still a dynamic in places like Iran, obviously. But there are other Muslims who are, since the 19th century, who thought, well, there are universal principles of progress, and actually we have some of them in our tradition, but we can also learn from the West today, or even other civilizations, to go forward when there are good ideas out there.
I want to ask you more about the relationship between Islam and liberty, but first let's stick with the Golden Age. And you mentioned how this was especially the early caliphate, a vast commercial space of merchants and traders. And as you pointed out, the Prophet Muhammad was a merchant, while Jesus, on the other hand, cleansed the temple of merchants. So you point out that there is a free market tradition within the Islamic tradition. Is it fair to talk about the Middle East in that way as a birthplace of capitalism in a way?
It is. I mean, you can, of course, trace capitalism back to even earlier civilizations. I mean, certain trade and markets, I mean, they existed in human history in different times and places. But there are historians. One of them is a friend of mine, Benedict Koechler, who's based in London, and who has this very interesting book, Early Islam and the Birth of Capitalism. And he says some of the basic institutions of capitalism, modern capitalism, actually emerged in early Islamic civilization. Why was that? I mean, first of all, Prophet Muhammad is, I think, a rare figure in the founders of world religions as being a businessman before he was a prophet, right? I mean, until the age of 40, he was a merchant, and his city, Mecca, was the center of trade in Arabia. And he's brought that understanding into Islam. I mean, he has sayings, hadith called in Arabic. It's like God will reward the honest merchant as they will be in heaven. They will be with the prophets and the righteous and the martyrs and so on and so forth. There he is a saying which says 9 out of 10 of God's bounty and blessings come from trade. So Muslims had that sense. The Quran has a similar approach. I mean, the longest verse of the whole Quran is about like a page long, is about how to write a proper loan contract. So there are really economic concepts. Early Muslims were merchants, and when Islam began to spread, Islamic law was developed by people who were merchants themselves. One of them is Abu Hanifa, the founder of the Hanafi school of Islamic law, generally the most lenient and flexible Sunni jurisprudence, although it lost some of its early dynamism later. Abu Hanifa was a great scholar of Islam, and he was a merchant. He was in silk trade. And Muslims really understood the importance of having contracts, enforcing those contracts. They thought about how can you carry cash in a long distance? Because if you carry cash, there can be bandits and it's dangerous. So they developed the idea of you can write on a paper that you have this amount of cash here, and you can go and show that paper somewhere else, and you can take the money there. This paper was called sak, which in Arabic means written documents. It is the origin of the check, which you use every day today. Several other Islamic techniques, banking techniques, as Benedict Koechler and other historians have shown, actually entered into Europe through Venice, through Italian city-states, and they were absorbed. That's why there are a lot of terms in English today with Arabic roots. Tariff comes from that. Also some words like alembic or almanac, or, well, even in English, they're called the Arabic letters, right? They came from the Arabic world. So there was this time, and I think, again, a friend of mine, Ahmed Kuru, has an interesting book, Islam, Authoritarianism and Underdevelopment. He actually discusses this issue, why Islam began to stagnate. And his thesis is that while merchants, the bourgeoisie, were the driving force in the early centuries of Islam, he also shows that in later centuries, after this early excitement with the Greek philosophy and cosmopolitanism in Baghdad, growingly militarized Islamic societies where landlords and military commanders became more dominant. And there was a decline in the bourgeois class in Islam. That's why non-Muslims became more successful over time in trade. And when you came to the Ottoman Empire, Muslims didn't know much about trade, but it was the work of the Armenians and the Greeks and the Jews. And that was actually realized by the Ottomans later, but it was too late. And that led to violence against, unfortunately, some of those communities at the end of the Ottoman Empire as well, I mean, due to a lot of political turmoil there. So yes, there is this interesting, like, we had something great and we can actually go and revitalize it. There's that sort of approach, I think, which is important, because let's not forget that, I mean, liberalism in the West evolved with still Christian references or with European references. You go back and say, wow, there's a verse in the Bible, for example, there's a saying of Christ, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, render unto God's what is God's. Now, this was not understood as a basis for separation of church and state for centuries, right? Christians didn't think like that. But in the modern era, when some Enlightenment thinkers thought it's a good idea to separate religion from the state, they looked back and said, oh, there's an interesting passage here, which we never thought of that way, but actually maybe it's a basis for separation of church and state, which became the standard almost interpretation among Christians today in America. I think that's the way to go forward. That's why I speak of Islamic liberalism. People are telling me, are you promoting Western liberalism? I'm saying, no, I respect Western liberalism. It had great things and great contributions, but I am developing an Islamic liberalism, which means we will go back to the Quran. We will see the Prophet in their own historical context. We will look at the early Islamic civilization, and we will get sources from there with the understanding that the world is changing and we have to reinterpret them, but also be inspired by them as well.
Speaking of finding interesting passages in the sources of religions, there is this famous verse 256 in the second chapter of the Quran about how there is no compulsion in religion, which seems like quite a remarkable statement in the 7th century, where freedom of religion was rarely a concept. On the other hand, it seems like there are many imams and certainly many rulers who think that there should be compulsion in religion. Can you talk about this passage, its meaning, and the controversy?
Exactly. Well, you are well versed in the Quran, Johan. I'm impressed. Like, you are becoming an Islamic scholar, I think, growingly.
I'm reading your books.
Oh, thanks so much. Yeah, you're so kind. You're quite right. I mean, there is this very interesting verse in Baqarah 256, the longest chapter of the Quran, and it begins by saying La ikraha fi din in Arabic, which means there is no compulsion in religion, which has become the motto of liberal-minded Muslims in the past century or so. Right? I mean, you can see it on websites. There's no compulsion in religion, so believe in religious freedom. But as you said, the medieval Islamic interpreters, the exegesis and jurists, didn't take this verse to the fullest liberal sense that we understand it as today. They said, okay, there is this verse which says there is no compulsion in religion, but what can it mean? It only means that Jews and Christians will not be forced to convert to Islam if they want to remain in their religion. So, and which was a great thing, by the way, at the time, still in medieval times, that you're not forced to convert to the religion of the conqueror. That was a wonderful thing. That's why Jews kept migrating from Christendom to Islam. But, for example, but they also thought, well, once you're in Islam, things change, because once you're in it, you cannot leave it, because then you become an apostate, but they considered apostasy as a crime punishable by death, which is not based in the Quran, but it is based on a saying attributed to Prophet Muhammad, which can be disputed. And also they thought that, well, if you're in the religion, you should practice the religion properly. You should do your prayers, women should be covered, and there should be police forces checking these things, right? This whole idea of a religion police, which is employed in Saudi Arabia, Iran, Afghanistan, actually is rooted in these medieval interpretations. That's why today some Muslims who are loyal to the medieval jurisprudence on these issues, they sometimes put a parenthesis in this verse. So there is no compulsion in religion reads, there is no compulsion in religion while entering Islam only, right? it means you can enter.
Are you really allowed to include an extra parenthesis like that in the Quran?
Well, they interpret it for you, and yes, interpretation is needed, but they do it. They're saying we're not inserting into the text, but with parentheses we're explaining. Okay. I saw this in Malaysia, and actually I was arrested by the Malaysian religion police after a lecture where I said religion should not be policed. There should be no people checking whether people are drinking alcohol. It should be their conscientious decision, right? Or whether they're having premarital engagements and so on and so forth. So I said, religion cannot be policed. It's a matter of the heart and mind. And then religion police came and arrested me, showing that, well, we mean business here. And their interpretation in their publications that there is no compulsion in religion, worse, is edited with that little insertion of there is no compulsion while entering religion only, which means if you're a Christian, you can do whatever you want, basically. But if you have entered in the lands of Islam, if you accepted Islam as a religion, you're subject to religious policing. Also, if you're a Christian and if you blaspheme, again, that will be in their mind a serious crime as well, which is also a burning issue in countries like Pakistan and even in the West these days, the idea of a blasphemy law.
Yeah. You also write about the Sharia law, which to many of us outsiders, when we hear about it, we mostly think of it about chopping off hands for theft and things like that. But you provide some important context, both about the context for corporal punishments at the time, but also how this idea of a law that doesn't come from the ruler, but from a higher source was also a way of checking and balancing the earthly powers, that not even the Sultan is above the law. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, sure. Today, of course, there are groups like the Taliban that do terrible things in the name of the Sharia, and I'm alarmed about all those. But I also want to give Sharia its due, right? People think that Sharia is this terrible set of medieval laws that are oppressive and corporal and so on and so forth. I think it's more complicated than that. And first of all, we should, I think, explain why Islam has a legal system, a law tradition, right? For many Christians, law doesn't come from religion. Why do you have that necessarily? Well, comparing Islam to Judaism here would be helpful. Judaism has a very similar tradition. It's called the halakha, right? And the halakha in Judaism, just like Sharia in Islam, is mostly about, first of all, your personal observance. Like you don't eat pork, boys get circumcised, you pray to Jerusalem or Mecca several times a day and pray. There are dietary laws. There are issues like that, communal and personal observance. And there's no problem with most of these things. These are matters of religious freedom. But when you come to the criminal law, both the halakha and the Sharia has things like blasphemy and apostasy should be punished, for example. And I'm critical of those. Now, what is different there? In Judaism, Jews have lost a religious state 2,000 years ago, and they became used to become civil communities living in as minorities. So something like stoning that you find in the Bible is not being implemented in the past 2,000 years, by Jews at least. But in Islam, there are people, because of the unbroken connection with religion and the state, there are those interpretations. And I'm critical of those interpretations. Two things there. Some of them are not even in the Quran. As I said, blasphemy and apostasy laws are not in the Quran. So they should be even very obviously questioned. And the Quran has some corporal punishment, as you said, for example, chopping of hands. There, I believe, chopping of hands for what? For theft, for example. There's a verse in the Quran which says if a woman or man who steals, they should be amputated. Their hands will be amputated. Now, I look at this in this way: is punishing theft a universal value? It is. In every society, theft is a problem, and you need to protect private property. Why would God punish, though, with this particular thing called amputation? Well, because the Quran doesn't exist in a vacuum. That is what Arabs were doing at the time in 7th century Arabia. There were no prisons in 7th century Arabia. So like in most pre-modern societies, corporal punishment was the only thing you could do. You couldn't feed people in a prison for 10 years. It would be more luxurious than you out there, trying to punish that person. The idea of a prison evolved in modern states and modern societies and so on and so forth. So I would say this is not meant to be taken literally. It means theft is a crime and it should be prevented. So today we can replace that with prison sentences, which actually in practice happened in, for example, in the Ottoman Empire to a great extent. But when it comes to Sharia, there's another element of Sharia that is actually interesting and valuable, I believe. It's that in classical Islam, Sharia also was a source of something we would call the rule of law today. Because the Sharia was rooted in the divine, it was in God's commands and the prophet's sayings. And the people who ultimately put that into written law, jurisprudence, were not rulers, but they were religious scholars who were independent from the rulers. They were sometimes they were not, but in theory they were independent. And this actually had a very good impact sometimes of constraining the rulers from becoming total tyrants, doing whatever they want. We have cases in the Islamic tradition where a ruler wants to overtax the population, and the scholar of Sharia says, you cannot do this. This is against the law, and the law is above you as well. So I very much believe in a major reform in the Sharia, getting rid of all its coercive, violent aspects that I don't think even is rooted in the very core of it. On the other hand, I think there's a spirit there that there should be a law that is above the rulers. It should not be the sultan's word or the kings or the prime ministers. In the modern era, of course, this was established in liberalism, thanks to liberalism with Montesquieu, the spirit of laws, and the idea that the laws should constrain the ruler and separation of the executive and the judiciary. So these three powers of the state. I very much think that separation of powers idea can be actually found in the medieval Islamic civilization. And the fact that the Sharia was separate from the ruler was an important aspect of that separation.
Very interesting and incredibly important context. What do you think is needed for that kind of reinterpretation to make sure that there is something that is more consistent with liberalism and modernity and not the other trajectories?
Well, I think we need more and more Muslims speaking about this. The thing about Islam is people ask, is there a pope in Islam who can fix these things by, I said, unfortunately, we're not like that. We're like Protestantism, right? Really Sunni Islam, where you have all sorts of more progressive or more conservative scholars and national institutions and charismatic ones. Sometimes are really worrying, sometimes are not too bad. So very diverse scene. But ultimately, I believe the more Muslims are convinced about the need for change in religious interpretations, they drive the religious landscape. I'll give you one example. Until the 19th century, there was an aspect of the Sharia that was terrible, and most Muslims didn't question it, and that was slavery. Islam had slavery like the Western world. There was slavery and concubinage. Concubinage was the female slave that the owner could sexually use. And there were slave markets in Istanbul and Cairo and so on and so forth. People who study this sometimes say that Islamic slavery was milder than the one in America, that slaves still had some rights, which is true. But still, it was terrible. It was slavery. And I think there are some people trying to justify it. I don't agree with them. But this was abolished. I mean, it took a long time. It began with the Ottoman Empire, Ottoman Sultan, with some British encouragement, banned slave trade in the middle of the Ottoman Empire. Then in the modern era, laws were passed banning slave trade. Some Islamic conservatives resisted this, saying that it's in the Sharia. But others said, well, actually, there's a verse in the Quran which praises freeing a neck. That's the term, which means liberating actually slaves. The Quran has a verse in which liberating the slaves is shown as a pious act. It doesn't abolish the institution, but it shows you a direction, right? So they said, actually, the Quran is showing a direction. So Islamic liberalism had a part to this. So today, slavery is most gone. I mean, at least legally gone. Unfortunately, it was too late. I mean, the last country to abolish slavery was Mauritania in 1982. So huge delay compared to the rest of the world. However, it was possible. And today, if you ask a mainstream conservative scholar, like a reasonable mainstream conservative scholar in the Sunni world, and Shia, they will say slavery was never an intention of Islam. It was just there when Islam came, and our religion, kind of mitigated it, and we wanted to get rid of it in the long run. But it happened recently, and that's a good thing. It's good that it's gone. So most people will say this. I would say that's good. So let's take the same logic to other illiberal things like patriarchy, like giving women less rights or using coercion or violence in religious matters. Because, early Islamic law had apostasy laws, the Byzantine Empire had the same thing just next door. The Sassanid Empire had the same thing just next door. So I think what I argue is understanding that what we see as the Islamic tradition is partly the unchangeable core of Islam. That's belief, the theology, God, afterlife, worship, certain ethical norms. They're fundamental. But then around this, there are a lot of historical things. It was just the things were done, like slavery back then. And it's important to go forward on these issues by taking some even inspirations from the religion as well. So I think this argument makes growingly more sense to a lot of Muslims. I see that in America. I see that in my home country, Turkey. I'm not a Islamic imam or mufti to give fatwas, but I'm trying to write about these issues so the thinking ordinary lay Muslims who are worried about these issues can see a direction to where we go. And when we have an attitude of change, a change of attitude in Muslim community, sometimes the imams catch up later. Because they see it doesn't sell anymore. It doesn't make sense to people anymore. So they're kind of taking a few steps forward.
Yeah. If it's possible there, it should be possible on other issues too. Speaking of values, and one of the causes of the rise of the populist anti-immigrant right in Europe has been the fear of Muslim migrants and the fear that they have ultra-conservative values when it comes to women, when it comes to sexual minorities, free speech and issues like that. The leader of the Swedish anti-immigrant party even called Muslim immigration to Sweden the greatest threat to our country since the Second World War. And indeed, there are some worrying polls about attitudes in some of these issues. What's your take on that?
I'm, of course, very worried about this far-right movements in Europe and United States as well. And I think they are dangerous in many ways. But I will also say this. It is true that some Muslim immigrants have very conservative values that are concerning. You can be conservative to some extent, but if you think beating your wife is totally fine, well, that's the conservatism that is concerning, right? If you think, blasphemy should be violently punished, and that can lead to some violent acts, even as we've seen in France, for example. But I'll tell you one more thing. Yes, some Muslim immigrants can be coming with these illiberal views, let's say, and very few of them will be close to terrorism. That's a very extreme position, right? But they will be illiberal on some issues. That's true. But they're also changing precisely because they are in the West. People think that they will come with these values, so they will transform the West. They don't see that the West is transforming these immigrants as well. I see this clearly in America, where polls show that the Muslim community in America has become quite liberal in many ways. They, for example, think gay marriage should be fine and Muslims should support it. Not that they would themselves maybe religiously accept it, but they say this is civil liberties issues. We are a minority as well, and that's another minority. There should be a solidarity of minorities and a progressive pluralists network is good for, a framework is good for all of us. So, and actually polls show that American Muslims are a bit more advanced than many of the European Muslim communities, especially compared to UK or France on these issues, which is partly possible because in America, Muslims were a bit better able to integrate into society. That is because this is an immigrant society. You can be American easily, It's a free market society. You have to, get your way up, and you don't live off the state, right? So you actually have to enter into the market, and that actually transforms your attitudes. and also there's ample religious freedom, unlike in France that like you can wear a headscarf or so those. What I would worry is that in Europe, if the host societies have a very suspicious and illiberal attitude to the minorities, they may close themselves to the outside influence and ghettoize. That has happened to some extent, and that is the problem, I think. Whereas if we have an open society and welcome immigrants to be parts of the society, they will enter with maybe some illiberal, maybe conservative views, but those views will change over time precisely because the society is open. They themselves become more open too. So I don't want to say there are no problematic attitudes among Muslims. There are. I myself find attitudes that are problematic, but they can change. And how do we change them? Is that we make Muslims feel at home in this free, open society, where they can engage with other people and see that the non-Muslim is not a nefarious, person of heathenism and conspiracies against Islam. They can establish friendships. They can establish business relationships. This is how liberalism evolved in Europe. I mean, different people began to trade with each other and became friends outside of their narrow, you're the Protestant, I'm the Catholic, and you're the heretic sort of boundaries. And so abolishing those boundaries while having important conversations within the Muslim community or within the West, I think is the right way to go.
Yeah, that's an incredibly important point, because historically we've often seen how the supremacists and the nativists of different cultures feed off each other. And when they experience then the hostility of one side, they close their own minds and become more aggressive. And that's one thing we need to avoid. You hold out the promise. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. I'm working on a new book, the Judeo-Islamic tradition, a forgotten story. There's this very interesting phenomenon of Jewish enlightenment in the 19th century, promoted by figures like Moses Mendelssohn, who's being called the John Locke of the Jews because he reconciled Judaism with liberal ideas of freedom and toleration. At that time, there were some Christians who were skeptical of the Jews to be able to integrate into European society. They were saying, oh, their religion is too legalistic, too conservative. And unlike Christianity, it cannot, embrace these liberal values and so on and so forth. Quite the contrary, what happened was Jews became, in many places, the pioneers of modern thinking, liberal thinking, in especially the Anglo-Saxon sphere. But this idea of an unknown people, their traditions look different to you, so you think they will be always a threat to your society. That can be a self-fulfilling prophecy sometimes, but that is ultimately destructive, harmful, to society, because it also it is worried about one illiberalism, then it turns its own society illiberal too, and then we have these clusters of communities which look at each other with suspicion.
You mentioned that the values of people change as they have new experiences and meet new societies, and it sounds like you're holding out the hope that some of this reinterpretation and reform of Islam might come in other countries than traditionally Muslim ones, in the meeting with more open societies based on rule of law and personal freedoms. And that makes me think about you write very interestingly and admiringly about Islamic liberals in different cultures, historically in the Ottoman Empire and other times. So my question is, where are those Islamic liberals today? Is it a growing group or is it just you?
Not just me. I have many friends and colleagues and acquaintances and people and organizations that I know who are working on these issues. You can actually today say that almost in every Muslim majority society, there are people who would identify as liberals, progressives, or classical liberals, libertarians, who are sometimes advancing ideas of freedom from a secular perspective, but there are also Islamic liberals, as I call themselves as well. I was arrested in Malaysia. Well, the people who invited to Malaysia to speak on these issues, the Islamic Renaissance Front, they were Islamic Malaysian liberals. They want to reconcile Islam with the ideas of freedom and toleration, and they're opposing the more coercive forces, the authoritarian forces in their country. Indonesia is a better scene where you have actually a major organization called Nahdlatul Ulama. Their leadership has taken very good steps towards what they call a humanitarian Islam. or more humane Islam. And what they're saying is that there are some problems in the Islamic tradition of supremacism and bigotry. We should cleanse them, and we should show Islam as the universal ethical message as it is. And for example, they called on Muslims to stop using the word kafir or infidel to define non-Muslims, right? I mean, people are non-Muslims not because they are vicious infidels who see the truth and deny it, but they just come from different religious backgrounds as Muslims do themselves. So that was one thing, for example, they emphasized lately. There are already Muslim majority countries that are pretty liberal, as I said, like Bosnia-Herzegovina is one of those. My wife is from there, I know very well. There are European Muslims already in those societies. And in my country, Turkey, there's a very terrible political scene, like a growingly feeling like Russia, unfortunately, under the growingly authoritarian rule of President Erdogan. But Islamic interpretations in Turkey are still interesting. There are people who speak about the importance of freedom in Islam. There are progressive theologians who publish and people who follow their works. So there are, the thing is, the Muslims who make the news are generally not the nicest ones. I mean, if you kill an innocent person in the name of Islam in the middle of Paris, of course, the world will be speaking about you in the next months and years. But other Muslims who are actually happy to be living there, happy to be contributing to that society, appreciate the values there, or speak about even reinterpreting Islam with a certain perspective, they don't capture the media attention. But I think we should not give into that dynamic of just seeing the most disturbing elements on the other side, which is, by the way, a dynamic that works on the Islamic side too. When Muslims look at the West, they sometimes see the most bigoted anti-Islamic voices out there, which make headlines. They don't see the true liberals who believe in human dignity and pluralism, like yourself, and like the other good people in Sweden who believe in freedom and toleration for all.
Yeah, I'm sure more people think that Rasmus Paludan is more representative when he burns the Quran, even though he's in fact Danish. But that's another matter. One last question. You have written and talked about these issues for a long time, and meanwhile things have happened, seemingly contradictory trends as well. We've seen the rise of authoritarianism in your home country, Turkey. We've, on the other hand, massive protests against the Iranian theocracy. We've seen some social reforms from the top in Saudi Arabia. And as you've said, democratic constitutional practices in countries like Bosnia, Indonesia, and so on. Can you help us just to make sense of all of this? Is there one dominant trajectory? Where would you say that the Muslim world is? What kind of a moment is this right now? And are you hopeful or depressed about it?
I'm hopeful in the long run. There are, I think, various trajectories, not just one trajectory, and different countries can be going to different ways. For example, you mentioned Iran. One thing that is very interesting in Iran is that we have one of the most repressive Islamic regimes in Iran since 1980, the Islamic Republic. And you would think that this Islamic Republic made the whole society very Islamic and everybody is... No, quite the contrary. In Iran, the Islamic Republic created a very secular society. Of course, there are a lot of pious and people who also sympathize with the regime too. But the Iranian youth, especially the urban population, has become very secular. The regime is forcing women to wear a hijab, a headscarf, which of course every Muslim should be able to wear freely based on her choice, right, if she wants to. But then because it's dictated, young women are burning the hijabs that is dictated on them on the streets. And there has been actually a very secular backlash against that. So I believe, I don't know that, I have friends from Iran who think that the regime will hold for a while too, but ultimately, like the Soviet Union, it will collapse someday because the big lie will collapse. So Iran might have a very different future at some point. In Turkey, my country, what has happened is that in Turkey, the religious conservatives who have been put down by the secular illiberals in Turkey, because unfortunately in Turkey, we had a secular state, but it was not very liberal on religious freedom or Kurdish rights, minority rights. Now, the religious conservatives have come back with a vengeance under President Erdogan, and that wave is going on. But it's also exhausting itself. It's growingly becoming more corrupt and less inspiring and nepotistic, and people see that. Its economy is going down because it lost rule of law and economic rationality. So I think there will be an end of this wave at some point. And I hope Turkey to mature, saying that, well, we've seen secularists dominating the country, Islamists dominating the country. Maybe nobody should, and we should have a pluralist democracy, right? Hopefully, I'm not sure when it's going to happen, but it may happen. I'll just remind people that, I mean, what the West's own story, I mean, the European countries did not become liberal democracies that easily, right? I mean, from medieval violence and sectarian wars, then came a whole, I mean, excessive nationalism, World War I, World War II, Holocaust. God forbid, I hope nothing that bad can happen again. But because societies learn by experience. I mean, you tell them this is a bad idea, but sometimes people want to try it and see it and go through it. And I think it's the job of us, people like us, to keep up the good ideas, right? And these are the better ideas, and to show them, explain them. Sometimes people don't realize them, they're good until they've seen the bad consequences, but it's important to keep them. So as Europe, ultimately Christendom, which was more oppressive than the lens of Islam a few centuries ago, have become a land of liberal democracies where people are free, whatever their convictions are, despite some of the now movements challenging them within, you know. But I think Muslims can find their way to freedom as well. And I think it should be articulated in a good way. And that's why I wrote this book, Why as a Muslim I Defend Liberty.
That's an excellent concluding thought, that if even Europe, with all its dark history and horrors,
among all places,
could turn into a liberal continent and an open continent, then surely there is hope for the Muslim world. Thank you very much, Mustafa. This has been incredibly interesting. And again, I think this is a very important book. There's actually a blurb on the Swedish version by none other than Johan Norberg. And it says that this is necessary reading for all Muslims who want to understand liberalism and for liberals who want to understand Islam. Well put, I think. So congratulations on your book, and thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thank you, Johan. That's a well-put blurb, I should say. Wonderful. You summarize what the book is about. And it was really a pleasure to have this conversation with you. I mean, I wish the best. I wish I could come to Sweden personally. There was an invitation for that. Unfortunately, I couldn't take that. But in the future, maybe, inshallah, as we say. But thank you. This was wonderful. Thanks to you and the people who brought us together.
Thank you. And we're looking forward to seeing you here.
Great.
Eventually.
Yeah, inshallah.
Thank you.
Thank you.